Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. This TV series explores a variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolent social change. This month, we'll examine civil liberties. The American people want our society to provide freedom and social justice. The building blocks for this are human rights and civil liberties. Unfortunately, too few Americans understand and support our basic constitutional rights. If we don't understand civil liberties, we can't protect them adequately. As a result, governments and right-wing agitators have been expanding police and surveillance powers, chipping away at our freedoms, and reducing our human rights. After September 11, 2001, this process got even more reckless and dangerous. This TV program will help the viewers better understand the range of civil liberties and how important they are for a free society. The program will also help you understand how to protect our civil liberties from neglect and abuse. So we have three guests who will help us figure all this out. All are people who know a lot about this and have been active with the American Civil Liberties Union, which is an organization that exists in order to protect these. I'm happy to welcome Don Clocksin, Gery Gerst, and Kevin Wimsett. Good to have you all here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's get clear just at the outset what we mean by civil liberties. Gery?
You bet. I'll try. Let me say that there are terms like civil rights and civil liberties that are thrown around. Civil rights specifically refers to fundamental protections that should apply to everyone, regardless of what your characteristic is. So that means whether you're male or female, your sexual orientation, your affiliations, your height, your color, your weight, whatever. Those are civil rights. And they get right to the heart of the 14th Amendment, equal protection. They get right to the heart of the Declaration of Independence, unalienable rights. And they get right to the heart of Lincoln's speech about all that we are all endowed by our Creator, and that every citizen, all mankind are afforded the same protections. That's it. Civil liberties is everything else that's protected by the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, statute, common law.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, when the Constitution was developed, the people who founded this country were very insistent to make sure that they protected these civil liberties. And could somebody tell us why they were so interested?
Sure, Glenn. I think it really goes back to we all learn through experiences, and the experiences that our early colonists went through was being oppressed by a British government who wasn't very tolerant, who didn't want to hear from ordinary citizens, who went out of their way to make life difficult for people who asked questions of the government. And so I think out of those experiences with the British government, when we decided that we were going to create our own system of government, we wanted to ensure that we had a government that respected individual rights and individual liberties. It's interesting to note that our first system of government, which a lot of people forget about, the Articles of Confederation, was a very weak form of government. And it was replaced by a constitution that was provided for a stronger central government. However, people were still very nervous about this new central government. How much power would it have? In fact, two groups broke out, the Federalists who advocated on behalf of adopting this new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalists who were really leery about this new government. In fact, the Bill of Rights itself came about because the Anti-Federalists wanted to make sure, hey, look, our rights need to be listed out somewhere, specifically protecting us from the government. And it's interesting to note that if you look at many of the amendments, and Amendments 1 through 10, many of them deal with when the government accuses somebody of something, that there are certain protections that they have. Just the top of my head, Amendments 4, 5, 6, and 8, right off the top, deal with the rights of the accused.
Yeah, and before that, the Declaration of Independence is this great listing of saying, here's how the king has abused us, here's how the king has abused us, here's how the king has abused us. So they were coming out of that experience of having been kicked around and abused by the monarch, the government of Britain. And so they had a track record, and they said, we don't want to make that mistake again. So,
And it's important to remember that they put it in the Constitution with the idea that it could not be changed except when the Constitution could be changed. So you could not, in Congress, pass a law that would repeal any one of those amendments. And I think that's an important principle that's been in existence ever since, and has been a fundamental principle for the ACLU, which is that people believe, I think some people believe, that anything that you can get a majority of people to vote for, they can change. And they can't do that with the Bill of Rights. And that's what's so important about it. It's in the Constitution. It's not a law.
right, and that comes up, for example, in some community where, say a high school where a majority of the students want to have a Christian prayer, and that violates the rights of the others. It's not like you can have a vote and make that public school a Christian school just by a majority vote of the students, or other things. You know, we white people can vote somebody who's not so white to have less rights. Oh no, yeah, the Constitution protects that. It's not just a majority rule thing.
Well, or otherwise the word right would not mean right. It would mean a civil favor or a civil bonus or a civil privilege. But it isn't. It said rights.
Yeah, and these are inalienable. So let's talk about some of these. Let's talk about the First Amendment, which is a lot of people's favorite part of the Bill of Rights. There's so much in it. There's freedom of speech and freedom of religion and freedom of assembly and freedom to push the government to try to solve problems, the petition for the redress of grievances. There's a lot of good stuff in the First Amendment. Could somebody tell us about some more about what all that means?
Well, the question is, when is the freedom of speech to be limited? And in the Constitution, of course, they said that it can't be limited. But the Supreme Court over the years has created some exceptions to that based on fundamental principles of commonality among the people, among the citizens. For example, the famous belief that free speech does not allow you to yell fire in a theater, a very famous phrase from a Supreme Court cases.
Clear and present danger
Clear
doctrine.
and present danger doctrine for war. There are limits to it, but they are very, very limited.
And again, it's like when you said it's not just a matter of majority stuff. If the majority of us don't like what somebody is saying, that doesn't mean that we can shut them up.
Right.
They have the right under the Constitution to still make their views known, and the government can't shut them up.
Right.
And I believe the ACLU's position, although I shouldn't just speak for them, has always been that rights are always inconvenient to someone, but that doesn't mean it diminishes my right.
Right, and it means that people, not just us folks, but also people on the opposite side of an issue, have the equal right to free speech too. So I know a lot. The American Civil Liberties Union has defended people at any point along the political spectrum, from communists and others on the far left to Nazis on the far right and everybody in between. Everybody has these rights, and the government can't shut anybody up.
Yep. They defend the principle, not any particular group or persuasion.
Right.
Yeah.
It's interesting, in Washington State, the courts have developed a body of law based on the free speech principle in the area of political campaigns. There have been several cases where a person would attack during a political campaign, would attack someone with something that in fact was a lie. And so there have been lawsuits. Those people have been punished by the Public Disclosure Commission or someone, and those laws have been challenged, and the Supreme Court has said even lies in political campaigns are part of the Constitution. It's part of free speech.
that's safer than trying to have the government be the arbiter of saying,
Yes.
you're telling the truth, candidate,
Right.
and your candidate on the other side is not, you don't want to have the government picking and choosing favorites among candidates.
And that was the whole point of
better,
putting it
better
in the
to let
Constitution.
the voters argue it out
And
have a vibrant democracy.
And honestly, all the more reason for citizens to be very aware that, when candidates are selling themselves in a certain light, that you have to go and really do your research. It's important for, I love various groups that are out there doing fact checks about what political candidates are saying, either about themselves or their opponent, because we all know that political campaigns can get distorted and they can get nasty. And that's why it's incumbent upon us as citizens to really filter through all of that and find out, well, what is the truth? And today with the internet and all the other sources of information that exist, there's no reason why people should be ignorant about the issues that are being debated.
And spinning off of what Kevin said, this very current Supreme Court has just ruled that corporations are people with free speech rights in campaigns. So couple that with the right to lie, and so now what you have is the megaphone owners can tell the mega lie. So we have to be even more vigilant on on who's saying what and how true is it.
At the other end of the power spectrum from big corporations are like high school students who, young people in our society don't have a lot of formal power, and there's a long history of schools trying to suppress students from saying this or saying that or publishing something in the school paper, and the ACLU has done a lot of very good work protecting the rights of students to publish what they want in school papers, or wear a T-shirt that supports peace or whatever, and students have been really well defended by the ACLU, and again, it's a case where a minority viewpoint by somebody with relatively low power is protected because even people under the age of voting age have constitutional rights.
Back to the black armband case of Tinker Des Moines.
Right, yeah.
I know that. Can I add in the First Amendment? I just want to be sure that we at least acknowledge that there's an overlooked piece of it, often overlooked, and that is the right of association, the right to assemble with people that you choose to assemble with. And that would include labor unions, forming organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation, forming political parties, or marrying the person of your choice regardless of sexual orientation. Association and assembly are very important to the First Amendment as well.
And also freedom of religion, which we haven't yet talked about, but that also, the same kinds of principles hold on that.
Thank you.
There's a lot of attention from the ACLU about cases where somebody is being accused of a crime or they're suspect because they may not be as American as we are or something, and so the government wants to search or seize something or sneak around and stuff. A lot of search and seizure stuff. Tell us something of those principles that are involved and what kinds of things happen and what the ACLU position would be.
What do you think, Don? You want to go?
Well, of course, there's literally thousands of court decisions on that. The Miranda rights, a common principle that have been established for a number of years, which requires you to tell an individual who is suspected of a crime that they could possibly be convicted based on their statements, and that they don't have to make those statements. As a matter of fact, there's just another recent case that's weakening that part of the Constitution. So search and seizure is a very, very complicated area of law, mostly criminal law.
Where they can't, like the police can't come up for no good reason and say, show me what's in your pockets, for no good reason.
Well, I think, for me, the case of Matt versus Ohio always pops into my head, where law enforcement had gotten a search warrant for one particular type of activity that they were looking for, and in the process of doing that search found something else, and then proceeded to charge that individual based upon what they found in the process of looking for the other stuff that they were looking for. And it's interesting because the Supreme Court was very blunt about saying, no, if you get a search warrant, you must specifically say what you're looking for, and if you find something else in the process of that, you have to go back and get another search warrant to go in and seize that particular material. And so I think it's very important for individuals to know that, one, they have to have probable cause, and two, the search warrant needs to be very, very specific. They have to go before a judge and say, look, we have a reasonable suspicion, probable cause that so-and-so is doing this. And the judge has to give an okay to do that. And so, if law enforcement or whoever else decides to show up at your door and wants to search your house, you have a right to say, no, I want to see the search warrant.
Right. There's another area of interest where I know the people who care about civil liberties have done a lot of work, and that's protecting people's privacy. Beyond what you're talking about, but just the whole notion of privacy, even though the word does not appear in the Constitution, the spirit of a commitment to privacy is there. I wonder if could somebody tell us something about that sense of privacy?
It's been called a penumbral right. It's something that when the Supreme Court had different membership than it does now, the court established a group of rights that are stated in the Bill of Rights and created this concept of a protection of privacy. And it's expanded, of course, into a number of areas, abortions, pregnancy rights, a number of rights. But it is, how do you say it? It is at risk of going away in the Supreme Court because it is a right that is a combination of other rights. Right. And so it is one of the most controversial, one of the most sensitive parts of the Constitution.
And I'm going to go back to the roots really quickly and say in England, 1215 Magna Carta, a man's home is his castle, fundamental right. Now we have the Fourth Amendment that says to be secure in your persons, your property, etc. They must have been afraid of, the peeping government. Well, I dare say if we search everybody's internet, everybody's home, everybody's car, everybody's at liberty, we're going to find something, sure. But the Fourth Amendment is there to keep that random searching from going on. Otherwise, I have no privacy. Yeah. Well, the sodomy laws in some states allow the police to peep through curtains. Look, we are really running, I fear, close to abolishing the privacy rights. Certainly with technology, Glenn. With the under the Bush administration, peeping in on everybody's telephone and telecommunication conversations. Yeah.
And this is one of the real tensions in being an ACLU member, I think, because particularly in the criminal area, not so much privacy, but in the criminal area, decisions that strike down convictions of some very bad people are controversial for the public because some may not understand the principle that if they do make a wrong search, the person cannot be convicted. And so the person goes free. And in many of those cases, the person is guilty. The person's done the act. But they will not be able to convict him because of a procedural matter. And I've always thought there was a tension among the population who thinks we can pass a law in Congress to eliminate this search and seizure or to eliminate the Miranda rule, but you can't.
But to follow up with what Don said, I think it's extremely important for people to understand that if the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to all of us equally, if we're going to say that it's only going to apply to certain individuals or to only those that are innocent, that's a dangerous precedent to set. I mean, the fact is in the 14th Amendment, it specifically talks about equal protection of the law. Yeah. And if the Bill of Rights works for you, it works for you, it works for me, it's got to work for everybody. Right. A person of color, someone who's a woman, someone who's a child, it's got to work for everybody.
Right. Yeah.
Which really brings the Arizona law into question right now.
Right.
Because probable cause is going to be real tricky
Right.
for searching people.
Right. Yeah. There's, it also leads us into the next thing I wanted to talk about. There's a concept called due process, which sort of means that the government can't just do whatever it feels like and yank you around legally. You've got some rights. There's got to be a fair process. Tell us something about the concept of due process. I mean, you had mentioned that, amendments 4, 5, 6, and 8 all deal with that in
Right.
some way.
It's interesting because, as a teacher, one of the things that I really try to instill in students is that, there's a rationale and a reasoning behind the paperwork, whether it be to fire somebody, whether it be to arrest somebody. There has to be a certain process that is laid out. I always give the scenario to my students of, what if I'm a law enforcement official and we pull you over because you were speeding? And without really asking you any questions, we put you in cuffs, we put you in the police car, we put you into a cell, and we leave you there for 5 years. What's wrong with that picture? Mm-hmm. Well, and then they start to say, well, wait just a second. I didn't get an opportunity to make my case. Exactly.
Yeah.
Were you read your rights? Well, no, I wasn't. Did they inform you of what you were charged of? Well, no, they just put me in the cell. That is extremely important to understand, is that we all have certain rights, and due process is extremely important. They have to follow certain steps, certain procedures, and it needs to be the same steps and the same procedures for everyone.
Right.
And it goes back to that whole equal protection under the law. We need to make sure that due process is followed for everybody.
Right.
And I would argue for not only citizens but non-citizens as well.
Right.
I think it applies to everybody.
Right. Well, the people who wrote the Constitution didn't say it pertains only to some of us but not to others. Right. So here we have people that the United States is capturing in other countries, locking them up, not even charging them with anything. They have no due process. And what does that say to other countries about the United States' commitment to fairness and justice and stuff? I mean, it makes our nation a hypocrite when we say it doesn't pertain to you because we don't like the country that you came from.
And remember, behind due process is the presumption of innocence. Now, it's darned inconvenient sometimes when you want to prosecute people or persecute them, either one. But the presumed innocence means you don't have to prove that you're innocent. Well, due process says we're going to take our shot, but here's what's up.
Yeah.
And then you get a chance. Otherwise, we're back to France with j'accuse. I accuse you, so there it is.
Yeah.
And, I thought we got away from that.
Right, right. Implicit in this, and I think we may have said this explicitly already, is besides protecting my rights, which I care about, I have to also be protecting your rights, because if we don't protect Don's rights, it sort of cuts a hole in the fabric of our society, and we got holes that people can fall through. So there's a sense of, if we're going to have a society that we can all feel comfortable and safe in, we've got to make sure that we protect everybody's rights, and then we've got something strong and solid.
I agree. I think the most recent example is Muslims in this country. I think that there's a great risk that their rights are being taken away simply because of their religion or their race, because of fear of a war. And I just, there's sort of deja vu happening. The ACLU back in 1917 actually came together and began as an organization during the war.
Yeah.
And because they silenced anarchists, they put people of color in prisons and in concentration camps, all justified by the war. And it's the ACLU that started at that time to fight that sort of discrimination.
Including the rights of people who opposed the war.
Yes.
Dissidents,
Absolutely.
conscience
Yes.
objectors,
Right.
other people They'd
Right.
throw you in jail just because you were against the war.
Right.
No, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the Supreme Court actually ruled in Schenck versus the United States that
Yeah.
the government could, because it could create a clear and present danger. You know, and that just, as a citizen, that scares me, because I think that if there's a time that citizens have to ask questions and understand the reasoning of governmental action,
Yeah.
that definitely is the time
Right.
with war. I mean,
Well-
that is the case.
And I know there's another case that you're concerned about. Fred Korematsu, United States citizen, was thrown into a concentration, or the government ordered him and all other
Right.
people of
Yeah,
Japanese
Fred
background.
Korematsu actually refused to follow the order to leave, because he was there. He wanted to stay with his sweetheart, and he was arrested. And then he appealed this case all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, "No, you know what? This is a national security issue. The government has every right to put you in a concentration camp." And the scary thing about that is this: is that Supreme Court ruling is still on the books, and it hasn't been challenged.
That's right.
And the fact that, Don mentioned Muslim Americans, who's to say that the government might say, we're going to round up everybody who's a Muslim, or everybody who is a Christian, or everybody who's a Jew, or any group,
or a pacifist,
any group that they necessarily don't agree with and want to silence. There's the precedent has been set that they could go ahead and do that. And that's scary. That's really scary.
Yeah, the Fellowship of Reconciliation at the national level was one of only two nationwide organizations that opposed that decision to put Japanese Americans in concentration camps. So we did the right thing back then in the 40s.
And I would add, so you've rolled several things together. There's the right of due process, the right of freedom of expression, and on and on. And I want to be sure we don't forget that women were treated as a separate entity. Woodrow Wilson, during the Sedition Acts, also put women in jail, had them tortured because they were proposing the right of suffrage and embarrassing the president.
The right to vote.
The right to vote.
Yeah.
So thank you. And so it can turn on anyone if we don't protect it for everyone.
Right. Yeah. And that's one of the things I like a lot about the ACLU is they really have that sense. There was a case a couple of decades ago when the secretaries at the National ACLU office were going on strike, and they were out picketing on the sidewalk out in front, and somebody asked one of the top people at the ACLU, "What do you think about it?" And, well, if they get arrested for picketing, we'll defend them, and again, it's that principle. You got to support that principle for everybody.
It's like what I always tell people, friends, family, who question sometimes what the ACLU does, and I make the argument, you may not always agree with what the ACLU does. I know I don't always agree with the positions that the ACLU takes, but you know what? I sure am glad that they're there, looking out for all of us and making sure that the Bill of Rights applies to everyone.
Yes.
Yeah. What happened after September 11, 2001? We've alluded to a few of these aspects. Could somebody tell us about what some of the changes were that happened? The Patriot Act, what that does, and habeas corpus, and a few of these things.
If I said everything changed, that would be trite, but also it would ignore history, because we've done this before.
Right.
We have done this before. But one thing that did change immediately is that Americans reverted to a state of fear. And in our history, I think it's replete with examples of when Americans are afraid, they all too willingly surrender their rights to the government and say, just protect me, and then expect they'll get them right back. And surprise, they don't.
Yeah, and so the Patriot Act was actually this humongous compilation of hundreds of pages of stuff that the FBI wanted or other entities wanted, and they knew they'd never be able to get it passed, so they were like sitting there on a shelf. And here September 11 comes along, they go, oh man, here's our chance to ram that through Congress. And they rammed it through, people didn't even read it, didn't think about the implications. And it's a whole lot of horrifying betrayals of our constitutional rights. It takes away rights, increases spying, all kinds of things. And I believe that we're weaker as a nation because we've given up so much of our constitutional rights.
I'll just give you one example, Glenn. This just makes me shake my head as an American citizen. The fact that all the major telecommunications companies, AT&T and Verizon and all the big ones, that they were willing to just turn over phone records to the government because they were worried that they might come across as unpatriotic or that they might get browbeat by the government. Phone records about anyone and everyone. And that, to me, without having probable cause, without having suspicion that somebody is doing something wrong, this idea that, we're just going to search everybody. No, we're just going to look through everybody's phone records. That is dangerous to me.
I have a feeling that there's a lot of wisdom, and it's not an exact quote, but I wish I could put a name on it. But anyway, it is that whenever there's a state of fear, world wars and attacks, what have you, is the government says, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter, if you only knew what I know, you'd be doing what I'm doing.
Oh, yeah, they use that all the time.
Yes, they do. And my response is, then tell us what you know, because it's our government.
Yeah.
And then we'll decide.
Right. Yeah, that's a way better way to protect our freedom than to have it behind
Trust them.
That attitude is so entrenched, and like you say, it's both parties. Bush took away, a whole lot of our rights. Obama was campaigning for president, saying, "I will restore the rights. I'll close Guantanamo. I'll restore habeas corpus. I'll stop torture. I'll stop these extraordinary renditions." He campaigned for a whole bunch of stuff, and once he got elected, then he's doing the same stuff. A lot of those practices are still continuing. And we have a bipartisan foreign policy at the most fundamental sense, and we have that bipartisan, I think, contempt for constitutional rights, as I see it, because a lot of those worst abuses are continuing.
But the ACLU and others are unraveling gradually the Patriot Act.
Right. Yeah.
There have been numerous decisions striking down portions of the Patriot Act. It's just going to take time.
Right.
ACLU, as long as organizations like the ACLU stay with
the Center for Constitutional Rights has been doing very, very good work, and others, they're trying to do this. But you can't trust the political parties to do it because they're enmeshed in it, and it takes groups like ACLU, Center for Constitutional Rights, and others to come at it from the outside.
I think you used the word, and you've used the word, and it's thrown out all the time, patriotic. And it is a tool of the worst order, I believe. And so I want to say that it's very patriotic to question your government.
Right.
It's fundamental it's not un-American. And so what's un-American is to trample all over the civil liberties and civil rights of people in the name of protecting them.
Right. Well, the so-called Patriot Act is really an acronym. It's I don't remember the whole name, but it's
USA Patriot Act.
But it's a whole lot of words, the initials for which become an acronym that spells out Patriot Act
On purpose.
And they did it precisely to tap into that meme and short circuit rational thought.
Well put.
Yeah.
Well
put. The ACLU has been critical of the so-called war on drugs, for a number of reasons, partly including search and seizure problems, partly for the right of privacy, the right to be left alone as long as you're not hurting other people. And they've been out in the forefront. I know the ACLU in Washington State has been saying we've got to really think this through again. We've got to have a good dialogue. And I know the King County Bar Association has done some very good research, and they're putting things out. And is there anything else that we want to say about the so-called war on drugs in the context of what we're talking about here?
We're losing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's been several battles in that war, and that's right. We're losing a lot of them. For a period of time, the battle was about drug testing, because people would, all of a sudden, employers or the government would require a drug test for someone, even though the drug test may not be an accurate test. And so there was litigation in that area for a long time based on privacy. And basically we lost a lot of those cases. But now we're moving, it seems to me, to be moving towards a public acceptance of some sort of rational drug policy, including, there's a lot of work's been done in California, of course, and Washington as well.
It's interesting, you know, as during my time as a Pierce County councilman, one of the programs that we kind of touted up in Pierce County was drug court. And we're starting to see a lot more models similar to that pop up all over the country.
We have one in Thurston County.
Yeah, the idea that, you know what, we need to get people, instead of just locking them up and throwing away the key, we need to get them into a drug treatment program and getting them the help that they need so that we don't have recidivism. I mean, one of the biggest problems that we face in local government is that our jails are overcrowded.
Right.
Why? Because we continue to, you know, recycle the same criminals through it, and a lot of it has to do with drug possession.
Yeah, instead of solving the problem.
Instead of solving the problem and
Yeah.
trying to get them the help that they need to kick that addiction.
I would add one thing, that one of the fundamental civil liberties and civil rights we all were talking about is equal treatment under the law. And what statistics is showing is that this war on drugs is focused almost entirely, the arrests, the convictions are aimed at a particular demographic, the poor and ethnic groups.
Yeah.
And the wealthy people who are engaging in what I call high-class drugs are almost unscathed by the war.
Right.
So it's very unequitable.
Crack cocaine versus cocaine, powder cocaine of the 80s.
Right. I know there's another area where ACLU has done a lot of good work around women's rights. You mentioned women's right to vote, but that took 70 years of struggle. And they finally got that in about 1920, but the United States still has not adopted the Equal Rights Amendment. The Congress said, okay, we'll do this and send it out to the states for ratification, and they couldn't quite get enough states to ratify it. So here we are, this nation that thinks of itself as a beacon of liberty and freedom and justice and equality, and we don't even ratify this Equal Rights Amendment, nor there's an international treaty about women's rights, and the United States has not ratified that either.
And I would go back to something Don said, as that I hope I remember it, is that the women's movement struggled from 1923 to the 70s to get an Equal Rights Amendment passed through Congress, and then it died because the southern states as a bloc voted against it. Well, so therefore you say, well, aren't women protected though? Well, women are only protected by statute. And as Don pointed out, statutes can change at the whim of the Congress.
Right.
So women really aren't protected equally.
Right.
They just are not.
That's right. Yeah, whereas the Bill of Rights and the other provisions of the Constitution are, they're locked in. I think it's interesting in the issues that we're talking about, there's a range of things that actually cut across the political spectrum. There are people on the right, on the left, in the middle, all kinds of places who don't want abusive big government. You know, conservatives talk about big government, and partly they're thinking about a government that works on health care or housing or environmental protection or whatever, but they also are leery of big government abuses of the kinds of things we're talking about, where they're spying on you, they're tapping phones, they're making arbitrary decisions that disenfranchise somebody in some way. And these are things, the kinds of concerns that we're talking about largely transcend across the spectrum, many of them. And
even the Tea Party should be ACLU members.
well, that's right. I mean, that's right.
Amen.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the principles, there are principles that we all have in common. And I think that's an interesting thing.
I'll go out on a limb and say that the stereotypical conservative is afraid of big government, correct? Except when it comes to the classroom and my bedroom and my doctor's office.
Right.
So you can't have it both ways.
Right, yeah. So people need to be thinking those things through. But the principles are there, and they lend themselves actually very well to what we're talking about, about the intrusiveness. The government can't tell me what to believe or how to pray or when to pray or whatever. Let's talk. We've been referring to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and I joined it in 1969. I really appreciate what they've been doing, and I've been a member ever since.
The year of Woodstock.
That was just a coincidence. Okay. But I wonder, could you summarize the history of ACLU at the national level? Because it goes back now almost a century, about 90 years.
That's right. Like I say, it basically was created around the issues with World War I that we've been talking about. I think it has about 600,000 members now. It receives no public money whatsoever. It is all dues and membership fees, voluntary membership fees. It has a standing policy of not endorsing any political candidates. It tries to stay as objective as possible and as close as possible to its fundamental beliefs.
Well said.
And there are separate agencies or branches of the ACLU in almost all states, certainly in Washington, Alaska, and Oregon, places around here.
And they have a national website that just has all kinds of information. You can get in there and spend all the time you want in there, and that's www.aclu.org for the national level. At the state level, it's ACLU-WA.org.
Right.
And I wonder, can we tell something about the state level?
Well, the state level is an extension of the national, of course, but they don't necessarily take their marching orders, say, from the national, and they focus on essentially state issues related to the Bill of Rights and civil rights. And it is a incredibly bottom-up driven organization. In other words, the membership is at ACLU. Of course, they have lawyers, etc., but it is very, very democratic and open. They are also incredibly effective if you join at sending out action alerts so that citizens say, what can I do? I want to know. They send out action and information alerts constantly, and you can waive them, dump them, or you can easily contact your legislators. It's so easy that people just can't say, well, I didn't know.
Well, and they try to inform people so that people get a sense of what the civil liberties are and what they mean, and so then some issue comes along and you go, whoa, that's a violation of such and such, and then they can organize to work on that. And I know you have served as a cooperating attorney. They have
in Alaska.
Besides a lot of direct member involvement, then they'll find attorneys to help out pro bono on some case, free. Donate your time to help work a case.
Although they have some
have
great
some staff.
Lawyers on staff
too,
but there's also private lawyers that are willing to take their time to help out.
And Glenn, there's local organizations like Thurston County. I'm part of the little committee that helped start the Thurston County chapter, all volunteer. And we do the part that I think the theme of tonight is education, that you inform. We hold forums for people who come from the public, anyone, and just talk about issues of concerns, issues of the day related to civil rights and civil liberties. It's very friendly and easy to access.
And as an educator, I've always appreciated the material that the ACLU provides when studying the Bill of Rights and sharing that with students and saying, hey, you know what, here's an organization who's trying to uphold the Bill of Rights and make sure that it applies to everyone.
Right. And I know there are a lot of issues. I do a lot of work on trying to abolish the death penalty, and the ACLU is a great ally on that. And in fact, a couple of us were at a county level ACLU meeting with a presentation about the death penalty a couple of years ago, and the ACLU collaborates with other organizations that work to abolish the death penalty, Amnesty International and others. And so there's so many points of contact because there's so many issues, women's groups and gay and lesbian groups and all kinds of reform and social justice kinds of groups.
And when you see all the disparate groups that they align themselves with or work with, just remember the core is it's not the groups, it's the principle of the Constitution.
Yeah.
That's the common.
Yeah. At the beginning of the program, I expressed a concern about civil liberties in this country that are, the public. I'm concerned the public doesn't understand them enough, and then doesn't know about protecting them. And I want to just check in with you. How well do you think the American people understand civil liberties? What
I think
condition
they
are we in?
instinctively understand it. People understand a tyrannical government or a government that doesn't act fairly with regard to accused people. I think people understand. I go back, however, to the fundamental principle. There are many, many people that still believe you can change a part of the Constitution with a vote of Congress. Or you can overturn, for example, you could overturn any position that we've talked about tonight that the ACLU is simply by voting for it. And many people don't get the principle that it's in the Constitution. And a vote, a majority vote that says we don't like this part of the Constitution is irrelevant.
Right.
To follow up with that, a couple of things. One, the amendment process, we all know, is a very difficult one. And I think that it's important to note that, there have only been 27 amendments adopted. And when you really look at the history, that's not that many just because
and
the
10 were right away.
Yeah, the first 10 were all in a chunk. 13th, 14th, and 15th were the Civil War amendments.
Yeah.
2 of them canceled each other out,
Right.
the 18th and the 21st.
Prohibition.
So, I mean, when you talk about the changes to the Constitution, it hasn't been a lot over our 200-plus year history of our country. I think the other thing that people need to keep in mind is that, our founding fathers started this great experiment, but they left it up to all of us to continue to fight and protect it and protect those values and beliefs that we had that are contained in the Constitution. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to continue to be vigilant, to continue to be involved, to be aware of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. When we were preparing for the program, and you and I were talking on the phone, and you said, when you get a driver's license, you have to pass a test. It says the rules of the road and stuff. Or when an immigrant becomes a U.S. citizen, they have to learn about our Constitution and stuff. And the rest of us don't have to do that.
Right.
And so, I still am concerned that although people may have an instinctive sense of things, that there are so many misconceptions out there, and a lack of, I guess, empathy or regard for somebody else's rights. So I care about my rights, but to heck with you and your rights if you're in a different demographic group or differently situated somehow. So that's my concern.
Yeah, I said something to you that perhaps I'll wake up in the morning and say, I wish I hadn't said that, but in my dream as a history teacher and civics teacher, I would sorta really like to see people have to pass a civics test to be able to vote. Do I really mean that? Not so much, but
it's a concept to play with.
Just
anyway.
a concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as we said earlier in the program, perhaps a couple times, sometimes there's a decision or ACLU takes a position for somebody's rights, and we don't like that position, but it's the principle, and you have to trust that if you adhere to the principles, that's okay, even if it's like I think one of you said, somebody's rights are violated in an arrest proceeding, they should not be convicted based on that unconstitutional behavior from the police, for example, and even if the person actually is guilty. But if we stick with the principles, we have a self-correcting thing, and we can uphold these values, and stay true to it, rather than cut corners and say, well, I know this guy's guilty, so let's go ahead and cut corners on the Constitution because we know he's guilty.
Well, an example, an approximate quote that gets to what you're talking about right now is, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Yeah.
So I have to put myself in your shoes. That could
Yeah.
be me wanting to say that.
Right. Yeah, it's that kind of thing, and that's what I appreciate, and I think a lot of people appreciate that about the ACLU. So even if we don't agree with every position they take or every person they defend or every case, it's doing the right stuff. So I think that's important. How are some other ways that our viewers could protect civil liberties? Certainly joining and contributing and volunteering and stuff. But what are other ways for people to be protecting civil liberties?
Well, as a teacher, and I'm sure Gery feels this way as well, I mean, part of our job is to educate, and that includes educating yourself. I think we have to be proactive. Interestingly enough, I was just thinking about Gary's comment about suffrage. We're not fully there when we talk about one person, one vote. We have many territories, for example, that don't get to vote for President of the United States. They have no representation in Congress. And so I think we have
we're
to...
talking about Puerto Rico,
all the
Washington,
territories.
DC.
They don't, my students were shocked that these are individuals who are born American citizens, yet they don't get an opportunity to vote for their president.
Yeah.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's incumbent upon all of us to educate ourselves, to be involved, and to be aware.
I know some would say the other thing we need to protect our civil liberties is our guns. There's a Second Amendment in there too, but that's a topic for another day.
Yeah, it's a very interesting that we've just gotten a decision from the Supreme Court that really changes the so-called right to bear arms. And it will be an interesting battle to find out what the end game is going to be with regard to individual rights to use and have and use weapons.
In the recent case, the court has made it pretty clear that yes, they
It's an
believe
individ-
it is an individual right.
It's an individual right.
Absolutely.
This whole thing about the militia, if the viewers understand all that.
The wording in the Second
wording
Amendment
in the-
says it puts it in the context of having
Right.
the militia.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court kind of went beyond that, actually.
Right. The provision in the Constitution says because we need a well-armed militia, there is a right to bear arms. Everybody's always assumed that meant the military. Many people thought it was the military, and the Supreme Court has now just turned that upside down. And it'll be very interesting how it plays out.
Yeah. But there are, ongoing evolutionary things like it used to be illegal in a lot of states to have an interracial marriage.
Yes.
And a number of other things that we now accept as, well, sure, of course that's okay.
Yeah.
People really had to struggle with and fight and overturn laws that enforced discrimination or injustices in various ways. So
it's been a struggle constantly. Even we forget that the right to vote, which we hold sacrosanct now, was only afforded to property owners.
right,
At
and
first.
men, property owners,
White men.
white, because Native Americans couldn't and blacks couldn't. So it was really a tiny. And when you limit it to property owners, it was only a few percent of the population.
I'll take a quick liberty.
Yeah.
Your question was, what can we do? What can people do?
Yeah.
And I say, get a concept in your head that this pie is not a zero-sum game. This is our rights. And to the extent that you get some rights out of this pie and you get some, I don't lose. It's a bigger pie. It's not a smaller pie.
There you go. I like
just-
that. That's a good approach.
And one thing, if we could just suggest to people that just read the newspaper or read online about alleged criminal activity, just put in your head what has to be proven and what protections there are before somebody is going to be convicted of a crime. The fact that the news writes an article about it doesn't mean that person's committed a crime.
Yeah,
If people would just take that principle when they read about some of these
job.
terrific events.
Yeah, we have a lot of people who've been convicted by the news media without any due process whatsoever, and so often it happens where if somebody knows something about the individuals involved, you know that the newspaper article is wrong, or the TV coverage is wrong, and you go, well, maybe they're wrong about the things where I don't know the individuals involved, and you really have to have a sense of skepticism, and the way you sort that out is you make sure everybody's rights are protected every step of the way, and that's way better than having a newspaper jump to conclusions. Can we get a closing thought from each of you folks, and then we'll wrap this thing up?
Well, I think actually being an ACLU member or a person that believes in the ACLU and the Bill of Rights is sometimes difficult because it does protect, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights does protect rights of some pretty nasty people. And yet you have to be committed to the principle that the rights apply to everyone all the time.
Okay.
Quickly, two things. The ACLU is accused of being liberal. The root word liberal from Latin means free, then I'm all for them. I don't care what party you belong to. But the second thing is that democracy is a verb. It's not a noun. We don't have it. We either do democracy for all of us or we don't have it at all. Who are we kidding?
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
As an educator, educate, educate, educate. Educate the community, educate yourself. In the world that we live in, information is at your fingertips. And I would encourage just the viewers to really use that as a tool to educate yourself. There's so much information out there.
Great, thanks. Well, I want to thank Don Clocksin and Gery Gerst and Kevin Wimsett. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. If we want a free and just society, we have to start by understanding and protecting the basic constitutional rights and civil liberties that all of us need in order to have a socially just and free society. Sometimes you see public opinion surveys and examples of public policy that show that maybe our people and our government don't understand these things, and we need to correct these and move ahead. The public cannot protect what it doesn't understand or value. And bit by bit, we see governments, we see big corporations, we see various kinds of forces trying to squeeze people into conformity, trying to eliminate differences, trying to expand police and surveillance powers, trying to undermine due process, and trying to reduce our constitutional freedoms and our human rights. We've had this tough on crime mania for a few decades. We've had this war on drugs for decades. We need to make sure that we run our society in a way that adheres to the principles that we believe in or say that we believe in. And I appreciate the American Civil Liberties Union, which has been protecting these for almost a century now, and encourage people to connect with www.aclu.org and www.aclu-wa.org for information about a variety of issues that relate to peace and social justice and nonviolence. Contact the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at olympiafor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make a better world, but each of us has to do our part, and the world needs just exactly what you have to offer. Thanks.